Greetings and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Rose Mason and our guest today is Travis Selmier. Travis is an affiliated faculty member at the Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis. Travis holds an MBA from the Kelley School of Business and a PhD in Political Science, both at Indiana University. Before returning to Indiana University for his PhD, he worked in international investments for 17 years, traveling to some 60 countries for research. He was named to Barron's top 100 portfolio managers list in 1998 and taught finance at Kelley from 2008 to 2011. A self-professed language nut, he reads 6 languages, was one of the 2 first foreigners to sit for the Chartered Market Analyst exam in Japanese in 1992, and won 3 of America's top fellowships to study Chinese and Portuguese. Reflecting his language interests, Travis recently co-authored a paper that looks at the relationship between language and corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Travis, thank you for joining us today.
Rose, thanks for having me.
So tell us why language is so crucial to international business. Do you have personal experiences where your foreign language skills gave you an advantage?
I think the best way to start is to tell a story that Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote.
Okay.
He said that on the African coast, traders would come, they would leave a certain number of goods on the beach, then they would go away, and the folks that they were trading with would come to the beach, look at the goods, and they would either leave the goods that they were trading those for, or they would adjust the amount of goods that they would leave. And this would go back and forth, and eventually a deal was struck. This is what Herodotus called silent trade. The reason they did it this way is they couldn't speak each other's language. So they had to basically transact based on adding to or taking away from the number of goods that were there. So that's transaction cost of language. We tend to think of language as something that's just given in business. We tend to think that we're constantly talking about business, we're constantly communicating, and so it's just an underlying. But actually, language has a huge impact on transaction costs. Time is money. Time you'll spend increases cost, but language can also decrease the transaction costs. So the fellow that I've done most of my language research he is Chang-Hoon Oh. He's a professor at Simon Fraser now, and he did his PhD here at Kelley, so he's within the family. Chang-Hoon and I wrote that language is a vehicle for culture. Cultural values are reflected in the language spoken. So cultural facility increases familiarity between the negotiating partners, so it increases trust. But language is a tool. So you can negotiate with language, you can transact in business, but you can't negotiate in culture. We can't literally negotiate in culture. So language is the tool that we use to transact business. If we don't speak a language, it tends to increase the costs, more time spent, or maybe we don't get as good a deal. But if we speak the language, we can also gain informational benefits. And in a modern economy, information is really almost the key capital input for many, many business transactions. So I'll give you you ask about, do I have any advantages, personal experience? I'll give you an example. About 20 years ago, I know you speak Japanese, so you'll like this one. This is about Japan. I went to Tokyo on one of my usual trips, and I went with a friend who was director of analysis at a Japanese investment bank. We went to see Hitachi. And the managing director at Hitachi, who talked to us, kept us over for 20 minutes, well over 20 minutes over the time. And he just kept talking and talking and telling me stuff. And he He divulged a lot of information that, while may have been publicly available, was very hard to get out of Hitachi. So we left, and my buddy, Kazama-san, turned to me and he said, you know, let's call him Ono-san, I don't remember his name, but Ono-san, Hitachi, I've been going to see him for 5 years, every quarter. He just told you more in one meeting than he's told me in 5 years. And he told you that because we did the whole meeting in Japanese. It was all in Japanese. So Ono-san felt comfortable with me and actually opened up. So in that case, although obviously I'm not Jap, I don't look Japanese, the cultural bond, the trust bond was so tight that Ono-san told me more than he would have divulged to a Japanese analyst, and certainly more than he would have told a portfolio manager who didn't speak Japanese. So yeah, that's a good example of how language actually adds an incremental advantage.
Wow, great, thank you.
Sure.
Could you tell us a little bit about when you what led you to the topic of language and CSR? How did this paper come about?
Yeah, so this paper came about. The odd thing is, Chung-Hoon and I had started to, Chung-Hoon has done some work in CSR, but he hadn't done a great deal at the time of this paper. I was familiar with it from reading, but I hadn't written anything. So call for papers, which is a academic term that journals sometimes put out. The Journal of International Business Studies put out a call for papers for a special issue on language and international business. And Aloysius Newenham Kahindi, who's at Edwards, let's see which way is north. That way, yeah. So he's over there in Canada, Saskatchewan. He's at University of Saskatchewan. He had been doing a huge amount of research in East Asia. So he's originally from Tanzania, from East Africa. Did his PhD in Dublin, teaches in Canada. So he had been doing 4 years already of research in East African mining CSR. And lots and lots of very interesting, very in-depth ethnographic research, along the lines of what Mary Yoko Brannon talked to you about last October, that type of research. He was doing this research specifically on CSR, and what he found was he kept getting these responses like, well, you know, the South African managers or the Chinese managers, they speak to us in Swahili, but the Canadian managers or the Swiss managers, they don't. And you know, at first Aloysius says, well, you know, that's very interesting, but I want to talk about these programs. You know, what's successful and what's not. And the questions kept coming back. The answers kept coming back to, these people speak to us, these people don't. These people, we feel that their corporate social responsibility programs work. These people, these firms don't. It kept coming back to language. So Aloysius said, I don't know much about language. I know a lot about mining CSR. So he started to look and see who had done research. Chung-Hoon and I had 4 papers out in what we call language economics. Mm-hmm. And he'd seen one of these papers, so he contacted Chung-Hoon, and 2.5 years later, the paper was done. It was quite a chore. But I think it's good to think about what Mary Yoko mentioned when she was here. She had talked about this idea of ethnographic research, and she defined it as the study of people in their own context. So this is what Aloysius was doing. He was studying communities of place, local communities that are literally right next to the mining sites, and oftentimes laborers come from those communities of place to work in the mines. He was studying their response to corporate social responsibility, CSR programs. And that's how the whole thing got started.
Wow, that's a very important emphasis placed on language in that.
Yeah, it was amazing. Yeah.
Can you tell us what are some of the biggest problems facing multinational enterprises as they try to create and sustain their CSR activities?
Well, I probably should answer that based on the paper itself. So focusing on the paper itself, we were looking at language and CSR. So the idea was communication. And the importance was that the important thing that we uncovered through the research that Aloysius had done, and then additional research which the three of us engaged in, and the discussions that the three of us had, were that multinationals must communicate with the communities that they're trying to address. So when we talk about corporate social responsibility, it means the corporation manifests a level of social responsibility towards each of the communities that they deal with. And you can imagine that this process is just fraught with issues. Because first of all, a corporation, a multinational, comes in contact with so many communities. We were looking at communities of place in this case, but they also come in contact with communities that are, for instance, my former job, portfolio management, so they come in contact with sort of the financial world. They come in contact with all the different groups that monitor how they operate from an environmental perspective, how they operate from a business perspective, how they ship their goods. So we found that they have to communicate with all these different communities in all phases of a corporate social responsibility process. The initial site selection, the project development, hiring of local workers, operations, logistics, all the challenges which come up. So in our case, we were looking at how they were or weren't communicating. And mining is a great study for this. It's really a good study because the mining is socially and environmentally extensive and intrusive. Yeah.
Wow, great. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I always like to learn something new.
Sure.
What advice do you have for multinational enterprises as they navigate through this new territory?
So I think multinationals need to be aware of the importance of language. We talk a lot about communication aspects, but I think the managers of multinationals need to specifically focus on language. And I'll give you sort of 4 suggestions. First of all, language is complex and perhaps not appreciated in a business sense. So the way I think to move toward language in a business sense, and when I say a business sense, I mean actually an investment sense, is to consider language talent as an asset, to treat it as an asset. And this means not just acquiring it. Literally think of the acquisition through hiring people, but also think of how to track it explicitly through personnel systems, and how to train, how to develop capacity in it, capacity among the corporation itself, but also among the people who work in the corporation. The second thing is they need to develop, in sort of along the lines of this, they need to develop a specific language acquisition program. And that means, and base that on cost-benefit analysis. Some of those costs and benefits are fairly easy to analyze. How quickly does it take us to translate this? How difficult is it to communicate? How much additional time is required? How much do we perhaps gain in market share if we have a very well-targeted product that addresses a language and cultural needs or desires of the targeted community that they're trying to sell into? Some of these are not so easy to do, but I think they can. I think it is possible to develop a cost-benefit analysis. And in this paper, we introduced this idea, and it's based to some extent on previous work by Law and Shankar, Johnson, Ricento, and others. The third thing is they need to copy the model used by one of the companies we interviewed. This is a South African mining company. What they do is they have what they call flexpatriates. So expatriates one step removed flex patriots. These are people who have specific skills in language or sociology or anthropology, and they are able to go into the local community, the local communities, gather information, and then come back and teach the managers. And also they're able to advise. So they're able to advise on, in this case, it's, mining is an extractive process, but such flex patriots could be used to better target a marketing campaign or better set up a production process. And then the fourth thing is MNEs need to recognize the risks that are involved with languages. So if the MNE manager's corporate structure is not doing this, then she can rest assured her competitors will be. So there is as language and culture move from simply being sort of hot buttons that sometimes managers inadvertently press by saying something wrong or doing something, perhaps not reacting in the way that local community may wish, they're moving from that to becoming core competencies. And I think Mary O'Brien talked about this when she talked about Tesco with you, that there is a move toward actually pulling in different language and cultural expertises into teams. So language should be seen not just as a challenge by these corporations, but should be seen as a resource and a right. And we argue this in this paper. But I think there are other ways to incorporate this idea of resource and right, and that's probably through cross-cultural teams, through recognizing that multilingual teams actually pull in different perspectives and can benefit from that. So I just close with multinationals headquartered in English language countries like our own shouldn't get fat and lazy about the idea that English is becoming a global lingua franca. Because as the educated world comes to speak English, those who are bi or multilingual will speak English, but will also speak another language. And those folks, the bi and multilingual folks, will have the competitive advantage. And we'll find that this advantage that we thought we might have had of, oh, the world speaks English, becomes a disadvantage because, hey, the world speaks English, but we don't speak another language. But people in Siemens, or people in Matsushita, or people in what's now Anheuser-Busch, Brazilians, speak another language, they have an advantage.
Wow, that's some great advice for them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Travis, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please contact us at ciber@indiana.edu.